right, here we go again. I hate it. You love watching it. It's time to update the college football top 25 heading into week 10 of the 2024 college football season. Here you go. Here's my updated top 25. Number 1 and 2 stays exactly the same. I've got Oregon and Georgia. Oregon got another ranked win this weekend, this time at home against Illinois. The game was never in doubt. Oregon dominated from start to finish. Final score 38-9. This coming up week, they're on the road at Michigan. So Oregon, of course, has a good win at home against Ohio State. They've got a good win against Boise State. They now get a ranked win against Illinois. They continue to roll. They're undefeated again next week on the road at Michigan. Georgia, I left at number 2. They're coming off of a bye week this past week. They play Florida in the cocktail party game this coming Saturday. Georgia has the win against Texas a couple of weeks ago on the road in Austin, 30-15. Their only loss, of course, coming on the road at Alabama back in week 4. So Georgia sitting there with just the one loss, and they've got 2 wins against teams currently ranked in everybody's top 10, Clemson and Texas, and neither game was particularly close. Texas 30-15, Clemson 34-3. I've got Georgia at 2. At 3, I've got Miami. I flip-flopped 3 and 4. So last week I had Ohio State at 4. I had Miami at 3. This week I flip-flopped them. Miami won again. They're undefeated. They beat what was left of the soul and dead body of Florida State's football team and program this past weekend, 36-14. Florida State scored a garbage touchdown near the end of the game. This game it was a little competitive for a while in the first half, but Miami obviously just a way better team. They get the win in the rivalry game against FSU, and I guess Miami can make state championship rings now like Florida State did last year, because Miami, of course, has beaten both Florida back in week 1 and now Florida State. Miami plays Duke this coming weekend. I've got them at 3. Moved them up. They're undefeated. Dropped Ohio State from 3 to 4. They didn't look good this past weekend. Now, they got to win against Nebraska. And in terms of where Ohio State falls within the Big Ten or their ability to get to the Big Ten championship game and, of course, then the playoffs, the fact that they won close doesn't matter. They're going to go off standings to determine the Big Ten title game. And if you win the Big Ten title game, you get a bye in the playoffs, regardless of whether you barely beat Nebraska or blew them out. But in terms of a week-to-week top 25 rankings, those kinds of things do matter. We just saw Nebraska get blown out the week before by an undefeated Indiana team, and Ohio State really struggled here and could have lost this game in the end. Nebraska had the ball at the end of the game with a chance to go down and win it, but Ohio State does get the win, 21-17. They continue to struggle to run the ball. Didn't look good running the ball here. I think they had about under 60 yards rushing or so in this game. They've got playmakers all over the field. Ohio State's talent is obvious when you watch them play. I mean, the wide receivers, both their running backs are really good. They've got NFL talent on all 3 levels on defense. It's just, for whatever reason, at least up to this point in the season, Ohio State's been unable to kind of put it all together for a complete game. Even the Oregon game, which was close, you look at the second half of that one, they had, I think, 19 yards rushing in the second half. You can tell when you watch Ohio State that once it clicks, they will be a dominant team capable of beating anybody in the country, anywhere, at any time. There's no doubt about it, and that's why they're in my top 4 and everyone else's top 4 or 5 or whatever. But I try to take speculation out of my rankings. I try to rely as little on opinion as possible. Now, obviously, some opinion is going to come into it anytime you're doing a ranking. But in terms of like things we can actually judge, whether you're talking about record, that, of course, favors Miami with a better record than Ohio State. You talk about the way they've looked, the way they've played, how they've blown out teams, whatever it is you want to look at. You know, I feel like Miami at this point, you could make a case, let's move them ahead of Ohio State. Has nothing to do with who I think would win the game if the two would play. I say this every time, but this is not a power rating. This is a ranking. So it's a combination of what a team deserves to be ranked versus kind of where they should be ranked. It's got nothing to do with who I think would beat who, right? Ohio State, I think, would have a great chance of beating Miami. So that's got nothing to do with it. Ohio State at 4. They, of course, have a huge game this coming weekend on the road at Penn State. And it looks like a must-win game for Ohio State. Ohio State's schedule, of course, right now looks much more difficult than it did to start the season because of the rise of Indiana. Indiana looks like a legitimately good team. Like I mentioned, we've seen Nebraska play Ohio State and Indiana or we've seen in Indiana, Nebraska play Ohio State and Indiana in back-to-back weeks. Indiana ran them out of the building from start to finish. And Ohio State, this was a competitive back-and-forth game for the entire 4 quarters. That doesn't mean that Ohio State can't beat Indiana, but if you're an Ohio State fan and you know you've got that one loss to Oregon and you're looking ahead on your schedule, forget the Big Ten title game for a second, which I know is a goal and a step towards where Ohio State wants to go. But forget all that for a second. You're looking at a possibility here where if Ohio State were to drop the game this weekend on the road at Penn State, that Indiana game would become an elimination game for Ohio State. Not just an elimination game from the Big Ten title game, but possibly an elimination from the playoffs altogether, which, of course, would be completely, totally, and 100% unacceptable for Ryan Day and this Ohio State team, given the fact that they went all in the transfer portal. They brought in all that talent on top of the recruiting and the star power that they already had there. They can get away with maybe not winning the Big Ten or maybe not getting a first-round bye or whatever. It's going to be hard to understand how they missed the playoffs entirely if that's what ends up happening. And I'm not suggesting that that will happen, but this is a huge game this weekend for Ohio State at Penn State, because if they lose, that Indiana game is going to be massive in terms of Ohio State for this season and potentially Ryan Day's future as head coach of Ohio State. But I've got them at 4. And right behind them there, I've got Penn State. Now, you can clearly make a case that Penn State should be ahead of Ohio State. I honestly didn't spend that much time thinking about it this week. I had Ohio State at 3 last week, moved them to 4. I had Ohio State at 6 last week, moved them to 5. I didn't spend much time trying to figure out or debate whether I should put Penn State ahead of Ohio State because they're playing this weekend. So obviously, whoever wins that game between Ohio State and Penn State this weekend will be the higher ranked of the two then in the next ranking. So I didn't really put a lot of thought or consideration into whether or not I should have Ohio State 4 and 5 with Penn State. At 6, I've got Texas. I don't really know what to make of the Texas-Vandy game. I mean, they were an 18-point favorite and they won by 3. But all week long, the majority of people that I talked to told me Vandy was beating Texas. So on one hand, you look at it and you go, well, that's disappointing. You know, you were a top 5 team and you were an 18.5-point favorite and you only won by 3. But then on the other hand, you look at it and you go, well, everybody was picking Vandy to win. So I don't know. I did bump them down 1 spot. I had them at 5 last week. I bumped them down to 6. Again, it doesn't really matter. Texas is on a bye week this coming week, and one team ahead of them at least is guaranteed to lose this coming weekend because teams 4 and 5, Ohio State and Penn State, play on Saturday. So don't get bent out of shape if you're Texas. I still think Texas is a really good team. I still think they've got a chance to win the SEC, make the playoffs, all that kind of thing. So don't worry about them being at 6. It doesn't matter. I've got Tennessee at 7, Clemson at 8. These are 2 interesting ones here. Tennessee, the loss to Arkansas, it's not a good loss, but they've got to win over Bama. They've got to win on the road at Oklahoma. They beat Florida at home. Some of those games were a little bit closer maybe than you would have liked them to be, but the reality is here we are heading into November, and Tennessee's only got 1 loss, and they have a top 15 win against Alabama. So I've got them at 7. The reason I have them ahead of Clemson is pretty simple. Even though both teams only have the 1 loss, Tennessee has a win over a top 15 team, Alabama. Clemson's got no wins over ranked teams. Now, that's not 100% their fault. It's partly their fault. They've played 1 ranked team, Clemson has. That was Georgia, and they lost by 31. Now, they've blown out the majority of teams they've played since then, and they look like a really good team. But because of the way the schedule falls, they haven't had an opportunity to beat a ranked team, whereas Tennessee has. So again, I'm not telling you that this means Tennessee would beat Clemson. I'm just trying to look at as much actual data as I can to determine these rankings and kind of leave personal feelings aside. So I've got Tennessee and Clemson at 7 and 8 respectively. Tennessee hosts Kentucky this weekend, and of course they're doing another home stadium gimmick with the spooky Halloween Rocky Top or whatever they're doing in orange and black uniforms. It's a different gimmick every week for Tennessee. This week, the Halloween gimmick. Clemson, who is coming off a bye week this past week. Let's see, where's Clemson? They play Louisville this coming week. This could be an interesting game. Clemson's defense has given them a little bit of trouble this season. Well, I don't know if that's the right way to put it. Clemson's defense, I don't think, has been as dominant over the course of the season as a lot of people thought maybe they would be. But the offense has picked up the slack. Clemson, offensively, has had a pretty good season. Cade Klubnik has had a pretty good season. I mean, you know, we spent a lot of time riding that Clemson offense last year and Cade Klubnik last year for their poor performance. You kind of got to, you know, reassess now. We're, again, heading into November this season, and Clemson's offense has played well this season outside of that week 1 loss to Georgia. They play Louisville. Could be a lot of points scored in this game. It should be an entertaining game. Clemson will be a favorite, no doubt. BYU, I left at 10. They remain undefeated. They won again. One of the weirdest lines or spreads or odds of the entire college football season, but BYU played at Central Florida this past weekend, a Central Florida team that's really circling the drain at this point. You got people calling for Gus Malzahn to be fired down there now. But for some reason, Central Florida was favored. Now, I fell for it. I was like, well, Vegas must know something I don't know. So I picked Central Florida. Well, BYU didn't get the memo. They go down there and beat Central Florida 37-24. They remain undefeated. They're on a bye week this week. Going outside of the top 10, starting with number 11, I've got Notre Dame back up to number 11. That's up a couple of spots from last week. I had Notre Dame at 13. I've moved them up to 11. They beat a ranked Navy team this past week. Beat really isn't the right word. They absolutely destroyed them 51-14. Navy outmatched in this game, and Notre Dame ran away with it. I've got Texas A&M right behind them at 12. They've got the same record, but we've seen these two teams play, right? Now, Texas A&M had a very impressive win this weekend against LSU. No doubt about it. No question about it. Great game for Texas A&M. They made the quarterback change, put Marcel Reed in the second half, and Texas A&M ran away with that thing over LSU in the second half. But the reality is Notre Dame and Texas A&M have the exact same record. I've seen the two teams play, and Notre Dame beat them. So until Notre Dame loses another game, it's hard for me to move Texas A&M ahead of them, no matter how many impressive wins Texas A&M racks up. Texas A&M plays on the road at South Carolina this week. They're about a field goal favorite there. That'll be a good game. South Carolina's record isn't great, but they've got a really good defense. In fact, they've got an elite front seven. And if South Carolina can put together any kind of offense at all against that Texas A&M defense this weekend, I think that could be a really good game. Notre Dame's on a bye week coming off their win over Navy. I've got Iowa State at 13. That's down a couple of spots through no fault of their own. They didn't do anything wrong. In fact, they were on a bye week. They play Texas Tech this coming week. But the reality is a couple of teams behind them, Indiana, Notre Dame, Texas A&M, all had pretty good wins this past weekend. So they just passed up Iowa State. That's all there is to it. In fact, I think I skipped over Indiana when I was doing the top 10. But you can see there I've got Indiana at 9. That's up 3 spots. I had Indiana at 12 last week. Now, Indiana didn't beat a great team this weekend. Who did Indiana play? Who did they play? Where is Indiana on here? They played Washington, beat them 31-17. I'm still bumping Indiana up from the week before. See, they played Nebraska 2 weeks ago, right? Beat the absolute soul out of them. Beat them by 30 or 40 points, whatever it was. And that was impressive. But then after watching Nebraska almost beat Ohio State this weekend, that Indiana win over Nebraska now looks even more impressive to me. So I'm not necessarily moving Indiana up into the top 10 at number 9 because they beat Washington 31-17. It's more of a recalculation of how impressive that win against Nebraska was from the week before. So I've got them up there at 9. They play on the road at Michigan State this coming weekend. So sorry to go back and forth, but I skipped over Indiana on accident between Clemson and BYU. All right, so we talked about Notre Dame and Texas A&M. Iowa State at 13, again, not because they did anything wrong. In fact, they didn't do anything wrong at all. They were on a bye week. I've got them at 13. They're still undefeated. Bama, I moved up to 14. I had Bama down at 17 after dropping their second game of the season on the road at Tennessee. But they had a dominating win this past week against Missouri. And while I don't think Missouri's a great team, and I've been sort of beating the drum about how overrated Missouri has been over the last few weeks for a while now, that was an impressive win from Alabama. That was kind of the version of Alabama I thought we were going to see all year. A team with a really good offensive line and a dominant ground game that played good enough defense to win a lot of games by a lot of points. And that's kind of what we saw. They shut Missouri down 34-0. They ran all over Missouri. Jalen Milroe didn't have a great day throwing the ball, but that not really a surprise. He ran the ball well. Justice Haynes ran the ball well. Jam Miller, the offensive line, played well. If Alabama sort of pigeonholes themselves into that kind of a team, sort of a ground and pound, we're just going to bludgeon you over the head for 4 quarters, I think they'll win a lot of games. And I think that is probably the best version of Alabama we could possibly see, is one that just lines up and says, we're just going to run it at you. And as soon as you start to move 8 or 9 people into the box, then we'll let Mildew throw a bomb to Ryan Williams. I think that's kind of the best case scenario for Alabama. And that's a very dangerous team. You got to remember, as bad as Alabama has looked at times this year, they're still one of the most talented teams in the country, roster top to bottom, in the entire country. So they're capable of beating anybody they play if they put it all together in a game and have a good game plan and everything like that. Anyway, I moved them back up to 14. They've got a massive game coming up in a couple of weeks with LSU, which is why I have Bama and LSU there at 14-15. LSU I had all the way up in my top 10 last week. They, of course, got blown out by A&M. I dropped them down to 15. Both of those teams have 2 losses. LSU, though, only 1 conference loss, whereas Bama has 2. But they play in 2 weeks. So all that will sort of work itself out here over the next couple of weeks. Bama's on a bye week this week. So is LSU. So both teams here get a week kind of heal up, rest, extra week of preparation. And that's going to be a massive game at LSU, probably at night. And it's a legitimate elimination game. Whoever loses that game next week between Alabama, not this week that we're in now, they're on a bye week the following week. But whoever wins that game whoever loses that game between Alabama and LSU, that'll be their 3rd loss. They'll be eliminated from the SEC title game and eliminated from the playoffs, in my opinion. It's a massive game, Alabama and LSU. It's a playoff elimination game. I've got Boise State at 16. They won again during the week, this time on the road at UNLV. And UNLV was a pretty good team, a team with a couple of Power 5 wins under the belt this year. They only had the 1 loss. And Boise State went in there and handled business 29-24. Alstoni and Gent Smith had about 150 yards rushing. So not the monster numbers that we're used to seeing them have sort of week over week, but good enough to get the job done. Boise State continues to roll. With Navy losing this past weekend, it's down to Boise State and Army, possibly Memphis in terms of who could potentially make the college football playoff out of the group of 5. But there's going to be a lot, I think, of momentum to get Boise State in there so people can see Altoni and Gentworth play against a legitimate defense in the playoffs. I mean, I think he's a great running back no matter who he'll play against, but I think a lot of people are going to want to see that. You may see a push for that. We'll see. But I've got Boise State now at 16. They play San Diego State this coming weekend. Pitt, I've got at 17. Moved them up 1 spot from 18. They blew out Syracuse. Was it Thursday or Friday night? They hosted Syracuse. Absolutely destroyed them. So Pitt remains undefeated. They've got some difficult games coming up, though. We'll see how much longer they can make it. They're on the road this week at SMU. You see, I've got SMU at 20. They had to me, a disappointing win against Duke this past weekend on the road at Duke. They win by 1 point. SMU did in overtime. A game that Duke should have won. Special teams miscues really cost Duke there. But anyway, Pitt undefeated. SMU with just a 1 loss, and SMU's loss is to BYU. So it's a non-con loss. So Pitt and SMU, 0 conference losses right now, along with Clemson and Miami. We're getting into the last month of the season. This stuff is going to start to whittle itself down, beginning with this Pitt and SMU game. It's going to be a great game. It's at SMU. I'll do an official prediction video on that game sometime this week, but I'm leaning towards taking SMU at home, although I will say I was impressed with what I saw from Pitt this past weekend. That game was over in the first quarter with the pick sixes. Honda McCord, quarterback for Syracuse, had by far the worst game of his year, probably the worst game of his career. But Pitt at 17, SMU at 20. I've got Kansas State at 18. Dropped them down a couple of spots from 16. I still like Kansas State. I think they are potentially the best complete team in the Big 12. I know Iowa State's undefeated. BYU is undefeated and has beat Kansas State. In fact, beat them and it wasn't close. But I still think Kansas State has a chance to win the Big 12. I dropped them from 16 to 18 because they played in-state rival Kansas this past weekend, a 2-win team that's not any good, and nearly lost. They sneak out of there with a 1-point win against Kansas, 2-point win, 29-27. Probably should have won by a couple of touchdowns. Army at 19. So I had Army at 20 last week. They move up one spot to 19. They're undefeated. They get their shot at Notre Dame here in a couple of weeks. Navy had a crack this past weekend. Didn't work out. They got blown out. We'll see about Army here and Notre Dame coming up in a couple of weeks. Army, let's see. I got to scroll down here. Sorry. Army was on a bye week, and they play Air Force coming up. So a game they should win. They should remain undefeated. We'll see. But Army at 19, SMU, we already talked about at 20. I've got Ole Miss at 21. I don't know what to do with Ole Miss. I think Ole Miss is a really good team, especially offensively. I love Jackson Dart. They've got some playmaking wide receivers. Their lines of scrimmage this year are a big improvement over what Lane Kiffin has had at Ole Miss on the lines of scrimmage up to this point. But when you watch them play again, some weeks they look completely dominant. Other weeks they look like they're kind of struggling to get it all together. And this past weekend against Oklahoma was a little bit of both. I mean, we all know Oklahoma's got a pretty good defense despite their record and their quarterback issues and offensive line issue and wide receiver issue. They're terrible offensively. There's no other way to put it. But they're a decent defensive team. And Ole Miss beats them 26-14 at home. So I don't. You got to remember, Tennessee, who's in the top 10, beat Oklahoma by 10. Ole Miss now beats them by 12. So you can't use the transitive property in college football. I'm not saying that to suggest that this means Ole Miss is 2 points better than Tennessee. What I'm saying is I've seen a lot of people piling on Ole Miss the last couple of days because they only beat Oklahoma by 12. And I don't really, Ole Miss playoffs, probably not. They're already at 2 losses. I think they had a good enough team to make the playoffs if things broke their way. Unfortunately, it's really that loss to Kentucky that's got them painted into a corner now. They have to host Georgia in a couple of weeks. They, of course, have the Egg Bowl against Mississippi State coming up at the end of the year. And then this week, they've got another tough game on the road at Arkansas. To me, Arkansas is a lot like South Carolina. At the end of the year, we're going to look at Arkansas, South Carolina, and their record is going to be what it is, which is not very good. But then you watch them play, and they're in a lot of games. What if you could take Arkansas's offense and combine it with South Carolina's defense? Probably have a pretty good team there. South Carolina plays pretty good defense, but they struggle at times offensively. Arkansas, on the other hand, can go up and down the field offensively with that quarterback, Taylor Green, that they brought in from the transfer portal. You got to remember, they lost to Oklahoma State earlier this year. Arkansas did, in a game where they put up 650 yards of offense. I'd love to see a stat about how many times over the course of history or the last 10 years or 20 years or something that a team has had 650 yards of offense and lost. So this isn't a game that Ole Miss can just show up and win. That's what I'm telling you. Is Ole Miss a better team than Arkansas? I think so. Should Ole Miss win the game? Yeah. Will Ole Miss be favored? Probably. But this is one of those games you see every single week where you look up in the fourth quarter and the underdog is winning. And Arkansas is at home. Ole Miss has to travel, coming off a tough game against Oklahoma. Who knows? We'll see. But every game from here on out for Ole Miss is an elimination game. They're sitting on 2 losses. 3 would knock them out of the playoffs for sure. There's no guarantee they get in with 2. So a 3rd would definitely knock them out. So a big game this week for Ole Miss on the road at Arkansas. I've got them at 21. I moved Washington State into my top 25 and moved them all the way up to 22. Again, this is maybe a little bit of overcorrection from me ignoring them in past weeks when maybe I shouldn't have been. But they won again, 29-26 this time on the road at San Diego State. I know that's a group of 5 team, but you got to remember Washington State, along with Oregon State, are the 2 teams that just got left out through no fault of their own. The Pac-12 collapses. The Big Ten takes half the teams. The Big 12 takes the other half. And Oregon State and Washington are sitting there going, hello, what about us type of thing. They've had to patchwork a schedule together at the last minute. And then you look up and we're heading into November and they're sitting there at just 1 loss. They're 7-1. There's not a lot of 1-loss teams in the country on any level. So I moved them up to number 22. Or am I convinced they're one of the best 25 teams in the country? No, I'm not convinced of that. But again, this isn't a power rating. This isn't a, this team would beat that team and that team would beat the next team and that team would beat the next team. It's not that. It's at some point, you just deserve to be ranked. And that's how I feel with Washington State. And of course, now that I've ranked them, they'll probably go out and lose by 40 this week. We'll see. Well, they're on a bye week, so that won't happen, but maybe next week. Anyway, I've got them at 22. Illinois, I've got at 23. I didn't move them down all that much. I had them at 22. I moved them down to 23. It's only their second loss. And here's the thing. Oregon would beat a lot of teams on this list by 30. A lot of them. Almost all of them. They would beat by about 30. So, yeah, Illinois went on the road to Oregon and lost 38-9. What do you think would happen if Oregon played Kansas State or Pitt or SMU or Washington State or Ole Miss or Memphis or Colorado or even Iowa State, Notre Dame, Bama, LA? A lot of those teams Oregon would beat by 30. So I'm not going to kick Illinois all the way out of the top 25 for losing to a team that's ranked number 1 and would probably beat a lot of teams in the top 25 by the same amount, so I left them there. Memphis at 24, another team new into the top 25. They, of course, beat Florida State way back in week 2 or 3. And at the time, it was a big deal. Memphis was undefeated. We weren't quite sure at that point exactly how bad Florida State was, and people were talking about Memphis as a potential playoff team if they could beat Florida State, which would be a Power 5 win. Well, they ended up losing the next week after the Florida State win, and people kind of forgot and stopped talking about them. But now you look up, and here they are sitting with just that one loss heading into November. And then I moved Colorado into the top 25. I just didn't want the whole season to go by without seeing Colorado in there. And let's be real, they've won more games than we thought they were going to win, right? They are bowl eligible already. They're sitting at 6-2. And if you look at their schedule, they could go 10-2. It's not beyond the realm of possibility that they go 10-2. Their schedule is very manageable. Some of the teams on Colorado's schedule that we thought would be good have turned out to be terrible. Kansas, for example. But anyway, Colorado won again, this time at home against Cincinnati, 34-23. Travis Hunter continues to play like the best football player on the planet week in and week out. And if he doesn't get an invite to New York for the Heisman, then I don't know what we're doing with the Heisman anymore. I think he should probably win it, but people that I think should win it don't win it all the time. So I guess I could find a way to live with that if he didn't win it. But if he doesn't even get an invite to New York, something is drastically wrong with the What if we get to December and they do the Heisman deal and neither Travis Hunter or Artonian Witt, neither one is a finalist? That would just be. So I hope that's not where we're headed. You know, I like Cam Ward, too. I like Dylan Gabriel. But it seems to me like those 4 at this point deserve to be the 4 Heisman finalists, right? Cam Ward, Dylan Gabriel, Travis Hunter, and Alton Jerry, the running back for Boise State. To me, makes the most amount of sense right now. But anyway, there you go. That's my top 25. Let me know what you think I got wrong, and I'll talk to you again soon. Have a good morning.